Have you ever laughed without realizing you were about to witness the end of something that seemed eternal? A television show that captivated millions around the world, known for its rapid-fire laughs, physical gags, and memorable characters, had its reign abruptly ended by a single scene. That show was The Benny Hill Show, and its story is more complex and disturbing than any comedic chase Hill performed on screen. Behind the exaggerated humor, quick laughter, and chaotic chases, there was a silent transformation in the audience, critics, and society itself, and one scene became the symbol of everything wrong, triggering an irreversible change in British television. Alfred Hawthorne Hill, better known as Benny Hill, was born in Southampton, England, in the mid-1920s. Some records indicate 1924, others 1925. The uncertainty already foreshadows a life marked by transformation and adaptation. Son of a surgical instrument merchant, Benny was not born on stage or under the lights of show business, but art ran in his veins. His grandfather had been a circus clown, leaving a performance tradition that subtly shaped the boy's imagination. From an early age, Benny observed the world with almost scientific attention. Every movement, every human reaction, was raw material for his future comedy. Before becoming a global icon, Benny experienced ordinary life. He drove cars, delivered milk, stacked goods in shops, and even played drums. All these seemingly mundane experiences taught him the essence of what would become his greatest talent: observing human behavior when no one is looking. He learned to notice detail, subtlety, the unexpected gesture, and to transform these small observations into humor. World War II was another decisive moment. Serving as a mechanic and spotlight operator in the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, Hill helped guide beams of light into the night sky, illuminating enemy plane movements. But it was when he transferred to combined services entertainment that his skill stood out. There, on improvised stages in front of weary soldiers, he discovered that comedy could be more than entertainment. It could be a form of emotional survival. Laughter, he learned, was a weapon against the darkness of war. After the conflict, Benny Hill carried this lesson forward. Inspired by the great British music hall performers, and especially by Jack Benny's precise timing, he changed his name to Benny and began shaping the character that would define his career. Radio was his first stage, with programs like Variety Bandbox and Benny Hill Time, where he mixed pop satire, eccentric characters, and James Bond parodies. But it was on television, starting in the 1950s, that his physical talent, expressions, and mastery of rhythm came to life. In 1962, Benny became the star of his own anthology show, playing different characters each episode. He explored comedic roles as well as Shakespearean adaptations, showing that his comedy could engage with seriousness and tradition. Over the decade, Hill consolidated his style: fast, visual, unmistakable humor, with recurring characters that created familiarity and expectation. Fred Scuttle, Harry Hill, and Jackie Wright were not just supporting players. They were essential pieces of a comedic universe viewers learned to recognize and anticipate. The true hallmark of the show came with the famous closing chases, always set to yakety sax, where Hill was pursued by a crowd of policemen, nurses, grandmothers, and young women, all moving in exaggerated comical fashion thanks to a filming trick that sped up the action. This was the show's signature, instantly recognizable and capable of eliciting laughter without translation. International fame followed naturally. The show reached over 140 countries, winning audiences in the United States, Australia, and beyond, without relying on subtitles or cultural adaptation. But in the 1980s, the landscape began to shift. The introduction of Hill's Angels, a group of highly choreographed dancers, brought glamour and spectacle, but also controversy. Some viewers appreciated the visual humor and elegance. Others, especially critics and feminists, began to see the women as mere objects for laughs, signaling a shift in societal expectations of television. Criticism intensified, but Hill remained internationally popular. In the United Kingdom, however, the wind was starting to blow against him. Humor once considered innovative was now seen as outdated. The chases that had previously provoked laughter were now interpreted as sexist and disrespectful. Then came the scene that would change everything: a beauty contest parody in which Hill emphasized every movement of the contestants, turning them into mere visual props for jokes. The audience that once laughed began to question. Critics, regulators, and even other comedians pointed out that this was the symbol of outdated, problematic humor. What had been just a joke became evidence of a culture that needed to change, and a line had been crossed. Hill, who had once commanded the laughter of millions, now saw his show challenged by a transforming society. Press commentary, ethical questions, and the rise of alternative comedians began to paint a different picture. The humor that had delighted generations was now viewed through a moral and critical lens. The 1980s no longer forgave old excesses. And so, while Benny Hill remained a worldwide phenomenon, in the United Kingdom his reputation began to fragment. The show that had defined British entertainment for decades was about to face its greatest threat. A single scene, loaded with exaggerated humor and controversy, now carried the weight of changing everything. And this is where the story becomes even more intriguing. How could a man who brought so much joy to the world see his work challenged, criticized, and ultimately cancelled? What combination of talent, timing, and cultural change turned laughter into outrage? These answers begin to unfold in the next chapter of Benny Hill's life. By the mid-1980s, British comedy was undergoing a transformation. A new generation of comedians, known as the alternative comedians, brought an entirely different style: sharp satire, political critique, and rejection of traditional slapstick. Among them, one name stood out: Ben Elton, who would become an incisive voice against what he saw as outdated and harmful humor. His words were not mere backstage criticism, they were pointed attacks, aimed directly at Benny Hill and his comedic style. Elton argued that the constant chases, suggestive comments, and visual gags on the show contributed to a perception of women as objects. To him, this was not just comedic exaggeration, it reflected a society that tolerated and even encouraged problematic behavior. For some, his statements were a relief, a belated recognition of an uncomfortable truth. For others, they sounded like an unfair attack on a man whose sole goal had always been to make people laugh. Tension filled the air. While Hill captivated international audiences, in his own country his work was being questioned more fiercely than ever. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Some critics supported Elton, using his words as a basis to claim the show was not only outdated but potentially harmful. Publications like The Independent attempted to balance the narrative, defending Hill as a relic of another era, someone whose humor belonged to a historical context rather than posing a real threat. But even these defenses could not stem the impact of the critiques. Culture was shifting rapidly, and comedy needed to adapt. The contrast was evident. While international audiences continued to enjoy the physical humor and sped-up chases, in the United Kingdom the situation became increasingly delicate. The Broadcasting Standards Council began weighing in on content, judging that elements once considered harmless, like semi-naked women being chased on screen, now needed to be questioned in light of current morals. The show that had been an icon of irreverence was now seen through a lens of censorship and social responsibility. Meanwhile, Hill remained active and confident. His international appearances, reruns, and global fame gave the impression that nothing could shake his reign. Yet behind the scenes, the pressure mounted. The cost of producing the show had become astronomical, each episode now equivalent to over €1 million in current standards. With elaborate sets, complex choreography, and a large cast, production required resources and attention, making the program increasingly difficult to maintain without sacrificing quality or relevance. Then came the moment that would become legendary, the scene that would symbolize the program's decline and cultural shift. A beauty contest parody, designed to provoke laughs, ended up exposing social tensions raw. Hill, in the role of a flirtatious host, emphasized every gesture of the contestants, turning them into mere visual elements for laughter. What had once been considered light humor now provoked embarrassment, outrage, and open criticism from the media, feminists, and contemporary comedians. A line had been crossed. Laughter was no longer universal, it had become a battleground. The impact was immediate. Newspaper critiques, television discussions, and radio debates questioned not only the program's content but its moral relevance. Young viewers, accustomed to more reflective and politically conscious humor, found little amusement in what had once provoked laughter. And the effect on production was inevitable. Complaints translated into corporate pressure. Thames Television, responsible for the show, began evaluating its viability under this new social, financial, and ethical lens. Changing tastes and culture were not the only forces against Hill. Alternative comedians, like Ben Elton, turned criticism into a movement. British comedy was becoming smarter, more aware, and Hill, whose talent lay in physical irreverence and slapstick timing, suddenly seemed outdated. Every sped-up chase, every exaggerated gesture, every visual joke, elements that had made him famous, became symbols of something no longer acceptable in modern television. The combination of social criticism, declining viewership, and rising costs led to the inevitable decision: the show would end. In 1989, after 21 years of episodes that defined an era of British humor, The Benny Hill Show was taken off the air. The news shocked fans and colleagues alike, but it also marked a turning point in television culture. The transition from traditional humor, often considered harmless, to more reflective, critical, and politically aware forms. Even after cancellation, Benny Hill tried to reinvent himself. In 1991, he launched Benny Hill's World Tour, intended to bring his comedy to international stages. However, only one episode was produced, Greetings from New York, and even with familiar faces like Henry McGee, Bob Todd, and Sue Upton, the attempt failed to capture the original magic. The comedy world had already moved on, and Hill faced the most difficult change of all, his own legacy. As the show concluded its run, Hill's personal life remained discreet. He lived simply despite financial success, renting modest apartments, caring for his own clothes, and shopping like anyone else. He never married, keeping his private life away from the spotlight. This contrast between the exuberant performer and the reserved man added a layer of complexity to his story. While the world saw laughter, Hill experienced solitude and introspection. In the following decade, his health began to fail. A minor heart attack in 1992, followed by kidney failure, signaled an imminent end. Benny Hill refused treatments that might have prolonged his life, and on April 20, 1992, he died in his armchair at age 68. Coincidentally, a job offer arrived that same day, an opportunity that never materialized, ending the career of a man whose comedy spanned generations but whose cultural relevance had become subject to debate and transformation. Benny Hill's meteoric rise, his ability to make millions laugh, and the fall triggered by a single scene became a fascinating study of humor, culture, and morality. What was once universal and light-hearted in one era became controversial and divisive in another. And it is in this contrast between laughter and critique, fame and rejection, that the complexity of Hill's legacy lies. A man who conquered the world with irreverent physical comedy, yet faced limits in a changing society. And this is precisely the point for reflection. How timeless can humor really be? How universal can laughter remain before colliding with social and cultural shifts? Benny Hill shows us that laughter is not just entertainment, it is also a mirror of the era we live in, reflecting boundaries, values, and conflicts that go far beyond the screen. Benny Hill's story does not end with the last episode or his death. It continues to live in every debate about comedy, morality, and cultural change. What was once considered harmless or merely silly is now analyzed through a critical lens, showing how society evolves and redefines limits. Hill became involuntarily a symbol of cultural transformation, an icon who laughed with the audience for decades, yet whose work was confronted by new expectations of respect, awareness, and representation. Looking at his career, it is impossible to ignore the complexity of his influence. He began as an attentive observer of everyday life, transforming small gestures and mundane situations into universal humor. Each sped-up chase, each exaggerated gesture, each physical joke was the result of decades of observation, practice, and dedication. Hill did more than make people laugh. He built a world where characters and situations were recognizable and relatable, creating a sense of familiarity that became the foundation of his success. However, that familiarity also became a vulnerability. As society questioned gender roles and ethical standards, what once provoked laughter began to attract severe criticism. The beauty contest episode, which many considered merely another visual gag, became a turning point. It crystallized all the concerns of critics, feminists, and regulators, showing that humor does not exist in a vacuum. It interacts with values, historical context, and social change. One scene, one joke, one creative decision can alter decades of public perception. The impact of that moment was twofold. Internally, pressure on Hill increased, high costs, constant criticism, and the perception that the show no longer reflected contemporary humor made production unsustainable. Externally, audiences began to view the show differently. The same joke that had drawn laughter in 1971 seemed dated, disrespectful, or even offensive by 1989. Hill, who had won millions of fans in the United Kingdom and abroad, now faced an environment in which laughter alone could no longer sustain a legacy. Even after cancellation, the attempt to reinvent himself with Benny Hill's World Tour demonstrated the challenge of adapting to a rapidly changing world. Only one episode was completed, and the cultural impact was no longer the same. Hill, who had always kept his personal life discreet, spent his final years away from the spotlight, living simply, almost anonymously, while his work remained both a reference and at the same time, an object of critique. Reflection on his trajectory leads to inevitable questions about humor and culture. How universal is laughter? To what extent can comedy challenge norms without crossing boundaries? Hill showed that the answer depends on time, context, and societal evolution. What amuses one generation may upset the next. What is accepted in one era may be rejected in another. Humor, like culture, is always in motion.